29. Wick watched Eret smash the last two arachnid survivors of Mirthandir's trap. He felt the warborn's pain, and Ovrum placed a hand on the massive man's shoulder in sympathy. Eret looked down with an odd grin that lay somewhere between acceptance and despair. After a moment, he looked away, as if their sympathy made the experience more real, more painful. Wick turned his attention to the massive doors. No obvious lock or handle presented itself, and he suspected that even if any of them were a master thief, it was unlikely they could open them. Even Zeg could not port through, despite having got a good look at the room on the other side. It wasn't for lack of trying, as the demonling tried porting in several times, each time flying back as if tossed by an invisible hand. Ovrum guessed it was magically shielded, a fact confirmed a few minutes later after Zeg tried to port in from other directions. If Wick didn't know better, he'd say the imp was worried.
"Well, what the hell are we supposed to do now?"
Wick asked, voice desperate.
"We need to break it down,"
Eret said.
"And just how do you plan on doing that? Gonna punch your way through?"
"Okay,"
Eret said, and punched the door with all his might. His fist thwacked against the stone with bone-breaking force, and the others winced. Eret pulled his hand back and examined it with a bored expression. It seemed none the worse for the punishment, but a mild grunt of pain burped forth from him, and he rubbed idly at his fingers.
"That didn't work,"
Eret said, and gave Wick a shrug. Wick's mouth hung open, and he gave Ovrum a sideways glance. The Zaidai shrugged, while Tifila examined the three-fingered hand.
"Nothing seems broken, but I wouldn't try that again."
"Warborn have steel-laced bones, very difficult to break."
"Apparently so. How about your head?" Wick muttered. Eret looked at Wick as if considering the suggestion, and Tifila cast a glare at him. Ovrum reached out a hand to stop any more absurdity. "No headbutting, and no more punching."
"You're wrong. That's exactly what we need,"
Wick said, and the others all looked at him.
"We need Avernerius. Even he isn't strong enough to smash through that,"
Tifila said. "Not yet," Wick said, dread building up inside him. He waited for understanding to come to Tifila. After a moment, her eyes went wide.
"There has to be another way."
"If you have one, I am all ears," Wick said, his shoulders slumping. "It's not like I want to do it." "Do what?" Ovrum asked. Tifila's eyes grew desperate as her mind failed to find another solution.
"Damn it, Wick,"
Tifila said. He smiled grimly and took her face in his hands. "I am yours, and you are mine." He held out the pinky of his right hand, and she took it with her own. "As long as you are with me, I can handle any path I am forced to walk." She held his gaze, and after a moment, she nodded. "Even if I grow a tail?" Her eyes snapped up at him, the glare telling him that now was not the time for one of his jokes. "I'm missing something," Ovrum said.
"He needs to up the power of Avernerius,"
Tifila said, worry burning her face.
"Being a tonic summoner is not as simple as some other specialties. It takes a toll, demands a cost. It is a cost he no longer wants to bear. He's been saving up his specialty points for a year, waiting on an opportunity to change his life. But we got caught by the Barrow."
She reached up and caressed the side of Wick's face,
and she sighed. This will drag him further into the voil and the despair.
Ovrim placed a hand on each of the small gnome's shoulders. Then it is a burden we will carry together. I will help. We will all help in any way we can.
Thank you, Ovrim, Wick said.
Zeg no help. Zeg like vile and despair. Stupid Bluehead will miss vile in despair. Stupid Bluehead look much prettier with a tail. Hope gets tail.
Wick sighed. The imp's comments hit too close to home. He enjoyed the power of the Thonic, loved it at times, and that scared him the most. Thonic summoning was like a drug, one that gave ever more fleeting gifts while demanding more and more in return. Eret walked up and awkwardly joined the circle of companionship, pulling them into a tight embrace.
Eret will help how I may.
I appreciate the kind words, big guy, but my face is kinda crammed into your, crotch.
Wick pushed back from Eret, extricating himself from the uncomfortable embrace. He squeezed Tifla's hand, took a deep breath, and looked inward, opening his interface. As his specialty sheets popped into the fore of his vision, he thought back on that first fateful decision that set him on the road to ruin that was his current life. He hadn't meant to become a warlock. Like many things in his life that would later bite him on the ass, his first Thonic summons was born from a practical joke. He'd learned his first spell from a wandering mage who'd come to their village one summer solstice. At first, the old spellcaster refused to teach young Wick any magic at all. But after endless pestering, the mage taught the young gnome a lesson and gave him exactly what he'd asked for. That night, as the rest of the village was fast asleep, Wick summoned Zeg for the first time. He sent the imp to terrify his younger cousin Jebus for tattling on Wick earlier that day. Sometimes, when he closed his eyes, Wick could still hear Jebus's screams. Then he had laughed, despite the tanning his father gave him in the aftermath. Now, the memory only sent his mind to his cousin's brutal death at the hands of the Balgroth, and the screams he heard no longer made him laugh. Jebus was gone, and Zeg was still here. That was all the proof Wick needed to prove he'd taken the wrong path. The realms could be a cruel place with a wicked sense of humor. Now he was doubling down yet again on that original mistake. But this time, he knew it was a mistake before doing it. Yet I'll do it anyway. He also knew there was no choice. Some things were bigger than he, and if they couldn't get through this door and help Gryph, the realms would face a terror unseen in millennia. Wick had 5 specialty points and 3 perk points in reserve. First, he opened the Thonic magic skill tree. He was an apprentice in the skill, with a current level of 31. The tier ability he'd gained at level 20 was called Thonic Binding. It enabled him to peer into the Thonic realm and bind the first demon he saw to him. From that day forward, he could use the ability to summon the bound demon once per day. He'd been both blessed and cursed when he'd performed the binding ritual. Few apprentice-tier summoners could ever hope to encounter, much less bind, an abyssal terror. Avernerius considered it an insult when confronted with the binding and almost ripped Wick's mind apart during the ceremony. That's probably why he looks so pissed every time I summon him. Wick assumed his luck was a byproduct of his 100% affinity for Thonic magic. But an offhand comment made by Zeg a few years back made him suspicious.
Zeg make practical joke. Very funny. Ha, ha, ha,
the demonling boasted. Wick didn't really believe Zeg had anything to do with Avernerius. Not really. After all, he was a lowly imp, and Avernerius was a lieutenant of the Abyss. The bastard was just messing with me, right? Wick pushed the ancient errors from his mind and returned to the task at hand. He'd long ago purchased the first-tier perks Mana, Effectiveness, and Item Power. All served him well, especially Item Power, after he'd taken the Staff of Zirgoth from the corpse of a goblin warlock a few years back. Among other things, the staff juiced up his summoning abilities by increasing the stats, attributes, and duration of any summoned chthonic creature. Mana reduces the cost needed for any spell in this sphere to the percentage listed. Effectiveness increases the effectiveness, damage, duration, heal, etc. for any spell in this sphere to the percentage listed. Resistance, the ability to resist a percentage of the effects of spells and weapons derived from this sphere of magic. Item Power, any magical item or weapon in this sphere has its effectiveness increased by the listed percentage. Item Power boosted the power of the staff by 25%. The apprentice tier of the same perk would add another 25%. He dropped a point into that perk. He also tossed another into effectiveness. Normally, that was not a perk you could stack, but the staff allowed for that kind of double dipping. A good thing the goblin warlock hadn't understood that, or he'd have kicked Wick's ass. Wick sighed, both in satisfaction and irritation. He hated wasting the valuable perk points making the demonic asshole Avernerius stronger, but he'd not be earning any more if he ended up dead. Who would have thought a high elf would be a bigger prick than a demon? The realms are a weird-ass place. He kept his last perk point in reserve. None of his other skills would be the difference between life and death in this current situation. That single point would be a beacon to his future self, one where he could remake himself. He toggled over to his specialty window, and a starscape exploded into existence around him. Each skill, also known as a master skill, was the basis of a specialty. A specialty was essentially a niching down of one of the master skills and required specialized training to unlock. A specialty could be earned at level 20 if the hopeful specialist found a willing master to teach them. At least 3 subskills became available to the specialist once a specialty was gained, each with their own perk trees. Subskills and their perks were not like normal skills. They were only available to someone of that specialty, and normally they enhanced the effectiveness of the master skill that spawned them. Wick's specialty was a warlock, one who worked to master chthonic magic. Cyrus the Mad, a powerful warlock who'd terrorized the southern tip of the Mirek Mountains north of Wick's home for years, was Wick's mentor. After decades of irritating the nearby dwarf kingdoms, Cyrus earned the ire of a mighty dwarf priest named Thardik. Thardik led a successful holy crusade against the demon summoner, ousting him from their land. Defeated and humiliated, Cyrus turned his gaze south to an area that included Aram, the small village of gnomes, humans, and hill dwarfs that Wick and Tifila called home. The people of Aram were not warriors and had little defense against the ravages of the mad warlock. Desperate to save his people, Wick gave himself over to Cyrus to be the man's apprentice. Wick studied under the vile man for years. During that time, he'd frequently and secretly saved the people of Aram from demonic attack, something Tifila reminded the villagers of whenever they treated Wick as a pariah. But eventually Cyrus earned the moniker he would die with when he promised the souls of all Edom's children to his demon prince patron for eternal, if damnable, life. Wick discovered his plans and pleaded with Thardik for aid. The dwarf was reluctant to take up arms with any warlock, even Wick, but in his heart he knew he was partially responsible for the destruction Cyrus now wrought. Wick convinced the dwarf, and, with the aid of Tifla, the half-orc mercenary Hugarn, and the wood-elf archer Zelyana, that Cyrus's madness ended at the same moment as his life did. None but Tifla knew they'd also had another's help. As Wick stared at the constellation of warlock subskills and perks floating above him, he grew solemn, and his mind drifted back to the fateful day he made his pact with the Chthonic prince Zorath Kurn Zakai. The reputation of Chthonic mages was awful, but that of a warlock was worse. Unfortunately, most of the stereotypes normal folk had of the breed were well-deserved and reinforced by assholes like Cyrus. But like any power, Chthonic magic was not inherently evil. To be sure, the demonic princes of the Chthonic realm long ago earned their reputation for despotism, evil, and soul-scouring, but that did not mean all warlocks were evil. Many warlocks made their pacts for the express purpose of fighting against the demon lords. Wick was that kind of warlock. A pact was a binding agreement with a power from one of the other realms. Warlocks were not the only specialty to make pacts, and, by and large, they all worked the same. They were binding agreements between another realm patron and a mortal. They were not one-sided affairs, unless the mortal was foolish or greedy. Like any other contract, they had terms, and both sides entered it with wide eyes. Wick made his pact with a prince who did not want his soul, or the souls of the innocent, or power, but information. Zorath was a broker of knowledge, and the terms of the pact were simple. Wick would provide his patron with information regarding the activities of its rivals and its rivals' servants, and in return, Wick would receive knowledge and power. Zorath helped Wick learn how to defeat Cyrus, and Wick helped Zorath remove one of his rival's agents from the chessboard of reality. It was a win-win for both demon and gnome. Yet, Wick could never trust Zorath, and each acquisition of power bound him tighter to his Chthonic patron. Den, as now, I make choices out of need and not desire. Am I being dragged deeper into the abyss? Wick toggled his specialty interface, and a series of prompts popped into his vision. Subskills. Subskills are skills related to the master skills, but are only available to those who choose a specialty. Most master skills will have 3 specialty subskills. EXP. Spears Staves is a skill, aka master skill, that anyone can gain. Weapon Enhancement is a subskill available only to those who choose the specialty Arms Magus. Specialty Perks. Specialty perks are powers derived from subskills and can only be earned by those trained in that specific specialty. They can only be earned by spending specialty perk points. Specialists earn 1 specialty perk point every 2 levels and can earn bonus specialty perk points by completing specialty-specific quests. Availability. Perks become available when the master skill has reached the respective tier. All sub-skill perks, nature, and abilities are shadowed until the appropriate tier is reached. Mana cost. Novice tier specialty perks cost 50 mana to cast. Each subsequent tier costs 2 times mana of the previous tier. A 100, JM 200, M 400, GM 800. Usage. All specialty perks can be used a number of times per day, determined by the following formula. 1 plus tier mastery minus perk tier. EXP. A journeyman can use a novice level perk 3 times a day. 1 plus 3 minus 1 equals 3. Apart from their exclusivity, specialty skills granted their adepts a deeper understanding than non-specialists. With a warlock, the subskills that fell under the umbrella of chthonic magic were chthonic enhancement, chthonic summoning, and chthonic weapons. His goal was to power up Avernerius. The Abyssal Terror was by far the most potent weapon available to their adventure party, and if they had any hope of not only smashing down the door, but of surviving whatever lay behind it, he needed to give the demon some serious upgrades. Chthonic Might. This perk tree enables a warlock to enhance the power and potency of any summoned chthonic being. B. Chthonic Weapon. Any weapon used by a summoned chthonic creature is imbued with the power of chthonic flame. Weapons do 2 times damage with a chance to set opponents on fire for 5 damage per second until flames are doused. A. Chthonic Armor. Any summoned chthonic creature will grow stony scales of cooled magma, increasing their AC by 50%. He'd long ago spent a point on chthonic weapon, with terrifyingly awesome results, so he tossed 1 point into chthonic armor. The idle part of his mind, the one that frequently got him into trouble, imagined just how terrifying plates of cooled magma would look on the massive demon. Chthonic Upgrade. This perk tree enables a warlock to use the power of the chthonic realm to improve their own bodies using chthonic traits. This usually comes in the form of improvements to their attributes and/or stats. Chthonic upgrade perks come with an increasingly likely chance to obtain a permanent chthonic trait. An obtained chthonic trait will have unknown abilities and consequences. Any offspring the specialist have may be born with chthonic traits, tails, hooves, etc., and will possess an affinity for chthonic magic at least the equal of the parent. B. Chthonic Blood. Imbues the specialist's blood with chthonic blood, granting them a permanent 50% bonus to health. There is a 10% chance to permanently obtain a chthonic physical trait. A. Chthonic Ichor. Imbues the specialist's blood with chthonic ichor, granting them a permanent 50% bonus to mana. It also causes their blood to be poisonous, and any beast that bites them will take 5 damage per second for 10 seconds. There is a 25% chance to permanently obtain a chthonic physical trait. Note: since chthonic upgrade perks are permanent, they require 3 times the mana cost to activate. This mana can be obtained via potion, item, or other artificial means. Wick's eyes went to the chthonic upgrade tree, and he gulped. He'd long avoided this array of perks for one simple reason. Upgrading one's own body with chthonic traits came with a risk of permanently mutating oneself into a chthonic hybrid. Being a warlock already made Wick unpopular. Becoming part demon would make him a pariah. But I need the mana if this plan is going to work. And to get more mana, he needed the chthonic ichor perk. Even though it sounds disgusting. He moved a specialty point into the chthonic blood perk, his virtual hand moving glacially slow. When it clicked into the slot, Wick flinched. Then he waited. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then his blood boiled. He would have screamed, but he could not move. Red-hot magma burned through his veins, and his heart pumped furiously. It lasted mere moments, but Wick hoped he never experienced it again. His health bar jumped up by 50%, and he felt livelier and more potent. An odd tingle twitched behind his eyes for several moments before it faded.
Oh, crap. Did I just become a demon?
A few seconds ago, 10% hadn't sounded all that likely.
But when have I ever been lucky?
He eased his eyes open and found that he was on his knees. Tifila was there, and she took his head in his hands.
My eyes,
Wick said in a panicked voice, and looked up at the love of his life.
Still the same sky blue I fell in love with,
Tifila said with a smile, and kissed him. She helped him up and hugged him for several moments before pulling back and smiling grimly.
Time to go back in.
Wick nodded and closed his eyes again, returning to the constellation of stars inside his specialty prompt window. He dragged another specialty point into Chthonic Ichor. Like before, it took several seconds for anything to happen. But then he felt as if he'd been dipped into a seething cauldron of sewage, bile, and various other excreta he did not want to imagine. He gagged and dry-heaved for what seemed like hours as the vile stew seeped through his pores and infused his blood and bones alike. Wick opened his eyes and keeled over as the rations the elves fed him came rushing back up. He vomited while Tifila rubbed his back.
Get it out. It's okay, baby. Just get it out.
A minute later, Wick recovered enough to stand. A massive headache from the huge expenditure of mana required to unlock both chthonic upgrades punched him in the brain. But a quick look at his blinking mana bar showed him the perk had taken hold. He sighed, before remembering that this perk also had a 25% chance of turning him into a chthonic hybrid. He moved frantic hands up to the crown of his head, but found no horns. He patted himself down, praying there was no dangling tail, cloven hooves, or claws.
Phew, that was lucky,
Wick said, grinning at Tifila. Then his skin began to burn, as if a horrible sunburn was flaring over the entire surface of his body. His eyes squinted shut as he screamed. Tifila reacted, and he felt her healing hands on him. Just as suddenly as it started, the pain faded, and he breathed easy again. His eyes opened, and 4 sets of eyes looked at him, wide with alarm. For a moment, Wick just stared back, and then spoke.
What?
Zeg chortled and laughed, his tiny clawed hand pointing at Wick.
Ha ha ha! You look like Zeg, except less good and more stupid.
Wick looked down at his hands just as they changed from his normal skin tone to the deep purple of a healing bruise. His skin rippled and flowed, and fine scales appeared along the back of his hands. He frantically pulled up his sleeve, hoping the color only inflicted his hands. But scales were flowing up his arms. A tingling sensation moved across his whole body, telling him it did not stop with his arms. He cast a terrifying gaze up at Tifila, who stared in horror and alarm.
Oh, fuck me. I'm purple.